All right, welcome everybody to the Thoughtful Bro live streaming on A Mighty Blaze. This is our very first author interview on A Thoughtful Bro, and I'm so excited. We're going to have Kiernan here today, as you can see, talking about his new book, Universe of Two. I want to give you guys a little bit of an intro into what the Thoughtful Bro is all about. I'm Mark Cecil. I'm a writer. I'm an editor. I'm a journalist. I spent my career mostly with Reuters News. I covered entrepreneurship and finance, but my true passion has always been books and just generally great storytelling in any place you can find it. So for me, once a week on A Thoughtful Bro, just sitting down with somebody and picking their brains about what makes them tick as authors, what makes their book work. This is really a dream come true for me. And again, so grateful to A Mighty Blaze for making this possible. A few quick items about the format. It's going to be about a 30-ish, 40-minute interview. We're going to take a little bit of audience Q&A at the end. If you have a question, you can pop it in the comment section of the Facebook page, and I will get to it as best I can. And then from today forward, we're at 12 noon today, but from today forward, we'll be at 2 p.m. Live every Tuesday on A Mighty Blaze. So with that, I am so thrilled. We have Kiernan here to talk about his novel, Universe of Two. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. Happy birthday to A Thoughtful Bro.
Boom! There it is.
There it is. Right. It's live now.
No turning back. So, Stephen, I want to give a brief intro. And then we'll launch into things. Stephen, for those of you who don't know his work, he's a journalist and a novelist. He has published over the course of his career over 4 million or about 4 million words, who's counting? Yeah. And he's won several awards, 40 awards or so for his work, including the George Polk Award and the Scripps Howard Award for Distinguished Service to the First Amendment. He's the author of 3 novels before this: The Curiosity, which is now in television series development, The Baker's Secret, which was a regional bestseller, and The Hummingbird. And he's also written 2 books of nonfiction called Last Rites and Authentic Patriotism. And we're going to touch on some of that too as we get into this interview. His latest novel, being published today, is a work of historical fiction called Universe of Two, as I said. Stephen, tell me what this book is about.
This book is about 2 things, I guess. At one level, it's a love story, foremost a love story. You see, it is, the cover is not lying. You can judge this book by its cover. It's a love story. It takes place primarily in 1944, and it is between a young mathematician named Charlie, who is involved in government math needs during the war, and his sweetheart Brenda, who is a musician whose family couldn't afford to send her to conservatory, and so she's working in the family's Chicago organ store. Charlie gets promoted within the work that he's doing for the government and finds himself at the Manhattan Project, where he's assigned a small but critical job in building the atomic bomb. He has a lot of moral reservations about this, as did many of the young men working on building the bomb. But he can't talk about it with anyone because of security reasons. So Brenda just sees that he has qualms and he's not doing the job. And she says, hey, my brother's in Europe. My best friend's husband's about to be in the invasion of Japan. Soldier on, man. Be a man. And he does. And as we know from history, the bomb succeeds in its mission. And after the war, Charlie feels a weight of guilt for his role in what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Brenda, because she urged him to move along, also feels some culpability. And together, they set out and spend the rest of their lives seeking redemption, and they find it.
Awesome. It's so good. It's such a great book. And on that note, Stephen, I don't always think this about all books, about writers reading their own work. Not all writers are good readers, and also not all books are kind of lend themselves to reading out loud. But I've heard you read the opening passage of this book, and I just think it's excellent. Would you mind just reading that opening passage for us?
Oh, okay. No, sure. It's just about 2/3 of a page. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. This is just the cold start. If you just picked up this book and opened it, here's what you'd see. I met Charlie Fish in Chicago in the fall of 1943. First, I dismissed him. Then I liked him. Then I ruined him. And then I saved him. In return, he taught me what love was. lust too, and above all, what it is like to have a powerful conscience. On first impression, Charlie was weak-chinned. To my girlfriends, I might have called him a milquetoast, soft as an old banana, which only goes to show how smart a 19-year-old girl is about anything. Now, I know better. It turns out the greatest kinds of strength are hidden and move slowly and cannot be stopped by anything until they have changed the world, which he did twice. I'm not exaggerating. I was there on both occasions. One time I helped him, the other time I hurt him. I hadn't intended any harm, but there's no denying that I used my influence to make him do terrible things, irreversible things. He forgave me. That was in his nature. But I haven't forgiven myself, even now, all these many years later. Some deeds are like tattoos, and the ink of regret is permanent. How did it start? As innocently as the chiming of a bell when a shop door opens. I was in the back offices when I heard it ring, letting me know a customer had come in.
Oh,
Game on, man.
it's so good. I mean,
Thank you.
hold up. Got to nerd out for a second. I mean, that is like a masterclass in how to open a book. What do you got there? You got a contract with the reader on tone. You're like, the reader knows exactly the tone of this book. You crush the voice. Then you kind of lay out the stakes of the book, how big the stakes are, and kind of like what the arc of the book will be. I mean, it's astonishing. And I will say to folks, you can't get this on Amazon or Goodreads. The last passage of the book, including up to the very last sentence, is also just as masterful. It is very emotional. And I mean, Stephen, you know how to open and close a book, I'll tell you that.
Well, I'm so happy you mentioned the ending, because I don't always feel that I nail endings, and I'm really proud of this one. I feel like it really came down to, it all came together in that last sentence, which was about, of course, as you would appreciate, the 20th last sentence that I tried. One thing I'll just say about sort of my method is I write very fast because I worked in newspapers for a lot of years. And so I'm a believer in a lot of revision. If you think about that second sentence, right? First I dismissed him, then I liked him, then I ruined him, then I saved him. I couldn't write the second sentence until I'd written the whole book.
Yeah.
Right? And the third sentence, same thing. He taught me about love and lust and conscience. I couldn't do those things if I didn't have the whole thing to work from. And so I don't get very precious about my drafts, because I figure more will come clear to me over time. So I wish I could say that prose like that just flows, on my fingers into the keys, but it's actually sanding, another coat of finish, sanding, another coat of finish. And I have taped to the wall, the shelf in front of my desk, a little piece of paper, an envelope, and on it says, "Not good enough." And that's not me beating up on my self-esteem. That's me saying, sand it one more time, give it another coat of polish one more time, because I want to, there's one sentence in there where she starts, not to get all geeky about it, but since you got me going, where she says, which just goes to show how much a 19-year-old girl knows about anything, that becomes her starting a sentence with the word which to complete a thought that began in the sentence before, becomes actually how she speaks. And she speaks that way in dialogue, and she speaks that way in narrative. And I didn't know that about her till I'd been with her for 100 pages or so. And so it's all kind of like, I'm not smart enough by a long shot to imagine the whole book. But when I have a whole book, then I can give it a coherence within itself. That's the goal anyway. That's the aim.
I mean, you made a promise in that first page or so, and you totally delivered with the book. I just also want to say that, I love that you put so much time into it, and then it comes off so effortless, and it lends itself so well to the spoken word. It's so accessible, so emotional, and let that be a lesson to everybody. I mean, you can polish something 20 times and then get it right. I mean, it is worth it to polish.
You always have to be thinking not quite good enough, right? That's just spurs to your ribs the whole way.
Yeah. So Stephen, on that note, I want to turn back the clock, and I want to talk about how the fact that you went to the Iowa Writers Workshop. Okay. So this is a thing. For anybody who is listening who doesn't know, saying you went to the Iowa Writers Workshop is sort of like saying you played football for Notre Dame or you played basketball for Duke. It's like sort of this mythic thing. It's probably the most famous writing program in the country. And so I guess what I want to say to you is, for those of us who didn't get to go to Iowa Writers Workshop, tell us what that was like for you in a nutshell, and kind of like what was maybe the biggest one or two things that you took out of that you bring into your writing today.
Well, I went to Iowa a while back, and I think it's a little more professionalized, and it's certainly more affluent now. You know, the program was broke, and I was broke, and it all kind of worked. And now it's, I think you get accepted, you don't pay tuition and that kind of thing. It's sort of, But here's the first thing that happened. The first thing that I realized when I was at Iowa was that I wasn't very good. There were a lot of people with enormous gifts, huge talent, and I'm not being humble about it. They're really, really good. And some of them have gone on to do nothing, and some of them have gone on to sell literally millions of books. And so, I was somewhere in that spectrum, and it was very humbling. The second thing I realized was that I'd had a spectacular undergraduate education because I'd read everything. Every conversation that people had about novels and many, many nonfiction books and many books of poetry, I'd already read it. So I knew what they were referring to, and I'd read the book, and maybe I read others. So that was really great. The main thing for me was that it was a way to transition from being a guy who worked in business all day and was writing in the early morning and kind of just keeping his hands around this candle to keep the flame from going out. That's how I was when I came in there. And when I came out of there, I was a guy who'd written thousands of words and many short stories and parts of a novel. And I started writing for a newspaper and found that I loved it, and that was a way I could make a living by the pen. And so I did it for many years. I guess there was a fair amount of posing and phoniness, and there was a ton of competitiveness, and there were a few select magnificent people who remain my friends to this day, and who I entrust with my early drafts, and who I go to when I'm fearful. And they continue to be like some of the pillars that my life stands on. And, if you think about it, semester is 14 weeks long, and it's a 4-semester program. So it really is about 1 year of your life. Okay. Well, now I quit the business job at the end of the year, December 31st, 1987. So I've been living by the pen, for better or worse, depending on the year, for 32 years. Yeah, I know, right? I'm knocking wood every day. I'm feeling very, very, very blessed and fortunate. And also, I take no days off. I work 365 because I need, but because I know how lucky I am, and also because I know my talent is small and I got to make up for it with work ethic. But it's just to say that 1 year's worth of time in Iowa, it assumes its proper proportion the further away you are. I think a year that I spent as a city editor was its own kind of education. Yeah. A year that I spent as a business reporter was its own kind of immersion in education. And so Iowa was fantastic for transition and launching, and also just being among people who had fallen in love with telling stories as desperately as I had, and the belief that we're all going to be okay.
Yeah, and that's just it, man. I mean, the kind of like moral support you get and the emotional support you get from finding your tribe of people, because it's not easy out here for a writer, and so you need other people who just kind of see the world as you see it, because it can be viewed as an irrational choice by some, and so you need other people, like-minded people, to be on your side.
Mark, I'd had some tastes of it because while I was doing the business job, I got 2 weeks vacation every year, and I would spend them at Breadloaf at the writers' conference. That was like my whole vacation for the whole year, was to go to Breadloaf and just like refill the reservoir. And that's what made me think, if I'm ever going to do this, well, I'll tell you the truth. I was really on the fence about it because my life was getting comfortable, because I had a good income, I had a great girlfriend, all of that. And then a guy who had been really my best friend since infancy, I was 27 years old, and he fell back and hit his head, and it killed him like that. And I had not really experienced, except for a grandparent, I had not experienced mortality close to me at all. And it was such a kick in the ass. And it made me realize it did not have forever. And so that's what made me kind of leap. and start my life as a writer was that loss and recognizing that if I wanted to ever lead the writing life, I'd better get busy.
Yeah, the clock is ticking,
was like
right?
first step, Yeah.
All right. Well, look, there's so much I wanted to get into. I had some other questions about Iowa writers, but I do want to well, you know what? I'm going to ask you this question because it does lead into what I think about your book and your writing style. I mean, there's this sort of discussion that's out there, and to kind of characterize it bluntly and oversimplistically, this idea that like if you get an MFA or MFA programs generally have a way of pushing people towards literary writing where you are going to write beautiful sentences and beautiful short stories, and you might have a living as a professor, and the holy grail is getting published in the New Yorker or Plowshares or what have you. And then on the other side, it's like everybody who's not got an MFA is some kind of genre hack who has no cultural impact and is just writing for dollars. Your writing is in this kind of perfect spot in the middle where it is literary and yet accessible. But I just wonder, like, can you just address that? What is your take on, I mean, RF MFA programs, did you feel that it was pushing you towards the literary? Is this a false choice between what is literary and what is commercial?
Well, I think that the way I've heard it defined is also, you have to spend years in New York City too, and there's sort of the MFA versus NYC thing.
Yeah.
And I worked and lived in New York City for a while, and I don't think either thing is exactly a credential, because really what happens is when you're on yourself for a couple thousand hours of solitude and you write a novel, and you have that wrestling with the demons and the ghosts and the unknown, and so that's kind of a bigger shaping thing. But let me say it this way. Rather than me make any protest about how I felt like my voice was enlarged or not overly directed or whatever, let me just name my classmates, okay? And we can and you can think what you think, okay? So Justin Cronin, right? He wrote the Passage trilogy, absolutely terrifying new orientation of the whole vampire idea. There are moments in it that are straight out of Greek mythology. It's incredible prose. John Marks, who has written, is a correspondent in Berlin and has written international stuff, and now is a producer for television. Chris Offutt, who has written, Kentucky Straight and a bunch of books that are sort of about the culture of Appalachia. Also wrote about his father, the pornographer. Who else is in my class? Tom Barbash, who writes urbane short stories that are really clever and kind of arch. Deborah Immergut, who published her first book at 55, I think, 45, Deborah, if you're watching. And her second novel is just out, and they're really smart and kind of mirrors for society anxiety. Kay Christensen has published a bunch of books of a whole range, including food. And then me doing this historical fiction. It's like, what professor, what teacher is directing all of those different imaginations in any kind of way 30 years later? I mean, let's call horseshit, okay? If you're putting your ass in the chair for that many hours, you are going to emerge whether you want to or not. For your strengths and your weaknesses are both going to be there on the page, regardless of who was telling you how to write compelling dialogue when you were 26.
Got it. I love it.
There.
Great.
Wow, I got striding, didn't I?
Hey, that's what we're going for on the Thoughtful Bro.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
So pivot now. Let's talk about, I'm going to want to lead into Universe of Two, but I want to talk first about your other work as an intro. Now, I see you're a guy who writes, you wrote a nonfiction book called Last Rites about terminally ill patients. You wrote a book called Authentic Patriotism, which is about, if I may, about kind of contemporary civic duty and like ways that ordinary citizens who are not in government make a difference in the society and kind of struggle for the soul of America, and like what is our real civic duty as Americans. And then you have three novels that you've written. 3 of the 4 novels touch on World War II. And so you don't shy away from big themes. You write about love, war, life, death, all the classic big time themes. And but 2 things that really jump out at me are there's a kind of moral churning. You have people, especially in this book, you kind of going through, is it moral or not to build a nuclear bomb? And also, like, what is America? What is the story of America? What does it mean to be an American? And I think, like, when I see you going to World War II, I'm going to hypothesize something, but you tell me what the real motivation is. Like, I'm wondering, why did Stephen keep returning to World War II? And I have to say, I was thinking about that. I was like, there's only two wars in US history that are unambiguously, uncontroversially good: the Revolutionary War and World War II. Every other war, in my opinion, World War I, Vietnam War, Civil War, there's narratives about those wars, but none of them come off as clean as World War II and the Revolutionary War. And I just wonder, I know in your 2010 book, Authentic Patriotism, you talk about kind of a service mentality and about American patriotism being adrift. Is the attraction to World War II that it is a time when the moral soul of America was more clear, and that's what draws you to it? I just kind of like to hear you say why that era is so interesting to you.
I want to give an anthropological answer before a personal one, okay? I'm going to talk about two different art forms. Since 9/11. Since 9/11, Hollywood has decided that the American story is about some sublime, extra powerful, extra moral person who is going to save us from our flawed selves. And Hollywood has made billions and billions of dollars telling that story over and over and over and over. And at the same time, the storytelling form of the novel has chosen two kinds of avenues that really, I think, and one is kind of a post-apocalyptic, the world has been destroyed, here's how we will rebuild with some kind of a moral landscape and the challenges of survival. And the other's been, I think, an astonishing, incredibly good and rich literature of World War II. And in those stories, in both of them, it is very much the committed moral individual who's an ordinary citizen, who's a flawed character, who is nonetheless doing their best to rebuild the world. And I see these as two very different but analogous responses to the blow to American culture that 9/11 was, and I think remains a blow to this day. And the national division, I believe, that we see right now is to some extent the terrorists winning in terms of what they did to what this nation is about. So now here I am. I wrote my first novel was about the moral questions of cell research. It was very influenced by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was about the moral questions of I guess you call it medical research and anatomy and cadaver dissection and so on, and how that went awry. So I looked at that from a cell standpoint. And then World War II was kind of a subplot when I started The Hummingbird. It was about one particular Japanese pilot who had a conscience about what he did during the war and spent a lot of his later years apologizing for it. And it was very much a subplot, and it took over in my imagination and became for me the more compelling part of the book and not the contemporary story. And then I was working on a story about a guy lost at sea, kind of a survival story. And it may have been a metaphor for myself while I was flailing around what my next novel was going to be, but who knows? And then I happened to hear the speeches that were given on the 65th anniversary of D-Day. And you had the Prime Minister of Great Britain, you had the first year as president, Barack Obama. And then they were introducing the French president to speak. And before he got to the podium, the news channel that I was watching went away and went to a train derailment somewhere in the South. And I remember thinking, I wonder what the president of France had to say. And I wonder how the French feel about D-Day. And that's how The Baker's Secret came to be, a D-Day story from the French perspective. And suddenly, without having planned it, I was up to my eyeballs in this literature of World War II. And I needed to read a lot of it to make sure that what I was saying was original. And I had to do the research that a lot of others have done and the travel and so on. And then I realized I'd written a Pacific theater book and I'd written a European theater book. And wouldn't it be interesting to write a home front book? And what could we say about that was new? And then I ran across a real guy. And the real guy was very compelling to me until I got into the details, and he didn't lend himself to a fictionalization of his life. So I created someone a tiny bit like him, but really only a tiny bit. And so that I could examine the moral question of the atomic bomb. And I didn't know this book was going to take me longer than 3 years to get done. Believe me, I didn't plan that it would come out around the 75th anniversary of the bomb. It just took me a long time to figure out everything and to do the learning I needed to write this book. But I think that it pertains in the same way that the French people and how they are overwhelmed by gratitude and feeling of unworthiness, that 250,000 people come to their shores and lay their lives down by the thousands to set them free. Unbelievable. And likewise, you just take an ordinary guy, a bright guy, but kind of a geeky, nerdy guy, and he's just, Johnny Do-Good, and his kind of brassy but colorful and musically talented girlfriend, and put them in way over their heads, just like we are right now, right this minute. And how do they find a moral way through the world? And in their case, part of how they're able to find that moral way through the world and their atonement and their redemption is in their love for each other. And we don't have a lot of talk about conscience today, and I believe that forgiveness and love for one another is going to be a lot of what we'll need to practice when we can come out of our houses and look each other in the face again.
Preach, brother. I love it. So, even I want to build on that. And that sentiment and this kind of moral searching that you've done. In the book, I noticed there were 4 or 5 different ways that Charlie Fish rationalizes building a bomb to himself, or that others around him rationalize it. They say others are building the bomb. Okay, so it's an arms race. And then another one is we won't use it. It'll just be used. This bomb won't ever kill anybody. It'll just be used as a demonstration. Another is, this is already happening. We've done worse. These cities in Europe are being firebombed. Civilians are dying. This is just, it's not a difference of kind. It's a difference of degree. Another is we hate the Japanese and they deserve this. So we're gonna take it to them. And then another is that, and this is kind of arguably has borne out, that this will actually save lives in the long run because it will create a more peaceful world. I just want to put it to you straight, Stephen. You're a guy who deeply enjoys deliberating over questions of conscience and kind of the true. You like to get in the engine room of the soul and figure out what's going on down there. I know that from all your work. And so, answer me this question: did the United States make the right choice, in your opinion? And whether you think they made the right choice or not, what does it say about America how does it add to the story of America that we did this?
Well, here's the first thing I'd say. It's not an American thing, it's a human thing. For as long as there has been humankind, whenever we developed a new weapon, the trebuchet, gunpowder, the airplane, we used it on the enemy troops immediately, as soon as we could. We always have. Slingshot to spear to nuclear sub. We've always used it. But against an opposing army. When you have an atomic bomb, it is so powerful, it does not distinguish between who it kills. The soldier and the toddler, all the same. Everyone within reach is destroyed. And that is an enormous line to cross in your definition of the rules of war, such as they are. And and what we know is that there was not a public debate about that in 1945. Once the scientists made this thing, the components were on a ship to the South Pacific the next morning. So it was the bomb was tested at 5:30 on July 16th. The USS Indianapolis set sail at 8:30 in the morning the next day.
I didn't know that.
Okay? And that day, 69 scientists wrote a letter to President Truman saying, "Don't use this on people." Now that we've seen it used, he's at Yalta negotiating with Churchill and Stalin. He's not really paying attention to the petition from the scientists. We don't know, obviously, what the outcome of the other paths would have been. We do know that the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was so persuasive, so thorough and merciless, that no one has ever dropped a bomb on people again to this day. However, It's a lot more complicated now. We used to, for all the Cold War, it was binary. It was us and Russia, China somewhat. But now, could Israel and Iran have an exchange of nuclear fire? Could North and South Korea? You know, India and Pakistan are battling over Kashmir today, right now, and they both have nukes. You know, suddenly it's a way more complicated sort of fractal arrangement as opposed to binary. And this is all super, 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 super dangerous. You know, when they set off that test bomb 100 feet up a steel ladder, a steel tower in New Mexico in 1945, it vaporized the steel and it turned the ground beneath it into glass, into beautiful green glass, a kind that had never been seen before, radioactive as hell. And, you know, you can put your head under your desk all you want. That's just the 1940s version of TSA, right? It's the theater of safety. And there still has not been a moral reckoning among civilians, except for, you know, sort of the anti-nuke folks who I think had planned a lot of protests for this summer until COVID intervened. And you have people who feel like, hey, it saved lives because the invasion of Japan didn't happen, which is absolutely so. I mean, the predictions were 1 million to 1.5 million deaths. You know, Paul, I can't remember his last name right now, who always writes about the infantrymen. Paul Fussell? Anyway, he said the infantryman loves the bomb because he got to go home and have a life.
Yeah.
You know, marry, have a family, have a job, have a life, instead of dying at 19 on some Japanese island where they're going to fight to the last man. So, you know, we don't have like a control set where we didn't drop the bomb. You know, it's a reality that we live with now. So how do we have a discussion about the morality of this weapon and the fact that it doesn't discriminate?
Yeah.
It just kills everyone within reach.
Well, it's just been an object. I mean, what's interesting is that like the Manhattan Project is just an object of fascination for so many artists over time. But, you know, what there's hardly any art and any writing about is what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, there's that Hershey piece that's so famous, but there's just not a lot. I mean, people love thinking about the Manhattan Project, but it's just the devastation is not something that's part of the popular imagination. Now, we're going to wrap up soon, but I just I did want to ask about this. I know from reading your acknowledgments that you actually met in person 2 survivors of the bombings. Can you just describe how that came about?
They were brought to, yes, I get goosebumps remembering it. They were brought to speak at the University of Vermont, and a friend of mine, a neighbor, told me that they were coming, and I went, and it was a gentleman from Nagasaki and a woman from Hiroshima, and they told their stories. And it was incredibly.
How old were they at the time?
Well, this was 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and they were, I want to say, 9 and 13 or 9 and 12 in 1945. So they're older folks now. Their English was quite good. And I remember the woman talked about, she was getting ready for school, and it was a sunny day, and it looked like someone had dropped a white coffin from a plane, and she held her arm up to kind of block the sun to see what it was. And she had kind of a gauzy sleeve, and it went off, and she still has a burn on her face from where her sleeve touched her. And the gentleman talked about how his mother said, get ready for school. And he was like bothering her because he was pestering his brother. And he went up to the steps of the house and was standing at the front door when it went off. And when he came to his senses, both of his arms were broken. He was, you know, all the way through the house and on the other side. The city was annihilated. His mother and brother were gone. And I didn't get, unfortunately, enough time to really say, like, then what? You know, I got to hear about their experience on those days, August 6th and 9th, but I didn't say, so then did a family raise you? How did you eat? How did you manage to survive? But I did dedicate the book to the people who did survive Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Oh, I mean, what a story. It's just, it seems separated from us in many ways. It seems like it's from a different, obviously, generation, almost a different era. But to think that there are people who were there that day who are just on this earth still is
so
just
Mark, I got to interrupt. It is from another era because of our culture. You go to Hiroshima and there's a memorial. You go to Pearl Harbor and there's a memorial right on top of the USS Arizona. You can see it in the water. You tell me where the memorial to the Manhattan Project is on American soil. There is none. It's denial. And you go to Los Alamos and it's scrubbed. The memory is scrubbed. There's a museum there and there's the new National Lab. The memory is scrubbed. And
what's the answer, Stephen? What's the answer? What should be done? How should this be reckoned with? In what way should it be reckoned with?
You know, I think about the complexity of the Vietnam War and all of the emotion around that. And I see the memorial in DC and I think, wow, is that good? You go to Oklahoma City to where those guys blew up the federal building and killed those kids in a daycare and all that. And the memorial there is incredibly moving. You go to Ground Zero. Ground Zero is a moving place to go to now. You can't stand and see that endlessly flowing water not be touched. How can we memorialize those things and not even acknowledge in any kind of permanent way the complexity? Not to resolve it for all time. It'll never be resolved for all time. It's war. But to acknowledge what has happened and give it meaning and have a place that people can go and be solemn and be humbled and think about the moral consequence of what we've done and maybe say, maybe we could do it differently. Maybe we should take a leadership role in some other way in the world. Since we were the first with this, can we also be the first in thinking about how we move past it? Sorry to interrupt, but it's just, it's a cultural choice we've made.
Yeah, no, this is what I want. And I had just a couple last questions, but this segues into something else I wanted to talk about. You've written so much nonfiction, but now in your career, you're moving into novels. And I'm just wondering, I mean, you were the editorial op-ed editor of the Burlington Free Press, is that right? I was
editorial page editor for 12 years. Yeah.
So you clearly are a man with experience in opinions, trying to shape public opinion and so on. So for better or for worse. But I guess my question is there something about fiction that you become satisfied with nonfiction? Do you think that fiction is a way into issues such as this and can elicit a response from people in a way that nonfiction maybe can't?
I'm trying to remember. I think it was Robert Penn Warren said, literature is news that stays news.
Yeah.
I wrote 1,000 words a day for 12 years, and I loved it. And it was an enormous privilege to be engaged in the public issues and to be learning about things so much. But some things take more than 1,000 words to articulate, first of all. And second of all, some things are so complicated, there isn't a clear right and wrong. But a story may enable you to see the moral consequence of these different points of view. And quite frankly, the emotional consequence. Like, I don't think that in the universe of two, Charlie and Brenda don't sit around and say, morally, what we did is wrong. They're just sad. And then as they seek redemption, they are happier and their lives have more fulfillment. I think that story is actually how we learn. For me, story is how I think. I am a terribly, terribly opinionated person, and story gets me to at least put it a little bit aside and let the reader arrive at their own conclusion. I haven't written an anti-nuke novel. There are people in there. There's a woman in there in particular whose husband's about to be in the invasion of Japan, and she is so grateful for the bomb that he can come home and they can have the family that she's wanted all her life. And so it's more about, can we think about this and can we spend a little time? I'm going to say one more thing and get a little highfalutin if I could. If you're a journalist and the governor holds a news conference and he says, here's my new transportation secretary, you sit in the news conference and you got to remove from the governor, oh, what's behind this, and this guy, I got to go find his record. And you go to write your story and you call the environmental groups and they say, this guy, he works for the paving industry. He just wants to pave this state. He's got no environmental values at all. And you call the paving industry and they say, this guy is great. And they exaggerate his anti-environmental views. So you have a remove from all these people. You write a story, you give it to your editor. Your editor wasn't present for any of these conversations. He or she has a remove and say, this is kind of controversial. Let's make sure the managing editor reads it. Managing editor is 3 degrees removed from it. The next day it's in the newspaper. The person picks it up and says, Burlington Free Press, that's a liberal rag. They got their review. Oh, Kiernan, he's got this disposition. It's fewer. Pretty soon the story the person reads and the reality are like a million miles apart. Now you take fiction. Galway Kinnell said, this is half the transaction. The other half is what occurs in the reader's imagination, in the movie that they generate. That's what John Gardner called it, right? This continuous stream of imagination where they forget that it's black marks on the white page, that there's an author, that there's even a book. There's just a story that happens. And when they get near the end, they don't want it to end. And when they close the book, the characters still live in them with a kind of poignancy and all that. And I think like there is no remove at all. It is so much more privileged. It is so much more in the mind and the imagination of the reader. I actually believe that that's close to sacred, that that's very, very powerful and important stuff. And that is a really much more interesting playing field than one where there are 90 kinds of separation from reality. And I hope I get to do it till, I hope like the last thing I do in my life is type the end of a new novel. Boom, Gork right then. That'd be okay by me.
Well, that'll be 50 years from now, I hope, Stephen.
Let's hope, man. I got stories to tell.
Listen, hey, I want to wrap on this one question. It sort of segues from what you were just saying, that like, is what I like to ask writers. Imagine you have the perfect reader. Now, first of all, do you have a reader in mind, like an ideal reader? Is there an image that you have, or not particularly?
I don't think I have an ideal reader in mind.
Okay.
No.
Let's just, all right, so maybe like it's not really a demographic question, but let's just say that like the ideal reader then is defined as follows, that it's the person who is having the exact response to your work that you hoped on your very best day that it would have. Like this book is just crushing for them, and it's, I mean, not crushing in a bad sense, but you were just like hitting it, you are hitting every note you want to hit, and they are hearing it. So they get to the last page of that book, an incredible last page, I will add again, but they close that book, and the feeling that they have at that moment is what? What is the note that you want to like keep playing in their mind? What is that feeling?
We need a word for that feeling, don't we, Mark? Because I know when it happens to me, and when I get to the end of certain books, there's a way in which I'm kind of ruined for reality for a little while. But it's the best ruination I can imagine, because something has happened to me and I have to like, I need a minute before I can come back to reality. And in fact, even a day or two later, pieces of the story are going to replay in my mind. I need to find a word for that. One of the characters in the Universe of Two is great at knowing the exact word to describe certain emotional conditions. And I had a lot of fun researching the different words for emotional conditions. But that feeling of satisfaction and nostalgia and fullness and almost loss because the characters are done. I think that if it works right, the process of finishing a novel as a reader is a reflection of the experience of finishing a novel as a writer, and what it is like to get to that place and say, okay, now I'm done with Charlie and Brenda. I spent 3.5 years with them, and I'm going to talk about them for the rest of my life, but I'm not going to be making them anymore. I'm not going to be seeing what they say. I need to find that word, but in the meantime, there is that feeling, and I want to give that not just to an ideal reader, but to lots and lots of readers. It gratifies me to no end that you mentioned the ending, because like I said, I think I got it in this one. And I hope that a lot of people reach that last sentence and go, oh yeah, that's where it was heading the whole time. I'm both totally surprised and it's completely inevitable. He was building toward it all that time. And I don't know how it happened, but I'm glad that it did.
Well, if I may, Stephen, I mean, I think, you know, there's a story about Tolstoy that they asked him, like, you know, what does Anna Karenina mean? And he said, if I was going to explain to you what Anna Karenina meant, I would have to write Anna Karenina again. And the whole point is like, if I could have said it in a more simple way, I would have. And it's like, in a way, like you have written this whole book because in a way you were trying to find the word for this. But I will say that the one word that really jumped out at me is fullness. I think there is a fullness to your work. There is a rich, rich fullness to the way you tell stories. And that's what I got from it.
Thank you. Trying to do it, trying to give just enough that the reader does the rest and has a very rich experience.
Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting in my last novel, I have a woman who's very beautiful, and I never describe her. But people accept it, and they all have a notion of her as very beautiful. And sometime I'd like them each to draw. I'd like to get a bunch of people, have them draw a picture, describe this beautiful thing, because it'll be autobiography, right? It'll be all these different versions of beauty. I never even say what color her hair is, nothing, just that she's beautiful, and I have people respond to her as they would to a beautiful woman. And it's the reader that does that magic part. There was once a workshop I was in many years ago. I was probably 20. And it was John Gardner was running it at Breadloaf. Maybe I was 21. And he described a hotel room. And he said that the paint was peeling off of the rusted radiator. And it was raining and cold outside. And there was a bar, neon sign that said bar, that was flickering and buzzing. And there was a leather shoe on its side on the floor, and the sole was worn through. Described the bedspread. And there were 50 people in the room, and 48 of them described the same bedspread. And I don't know how that works. And John Gardner was a genius at that sort of thing, right? But every book I write, I trust the reader's imagination more. And that means that in some ways I do less and suggest more, and let the reader make the woman beautiful. And so that when the book ends, they feel that they've parted from the great beauty of their lives, because it's of their life, not mine, not my idea. I don't know how it works.
Well, it does work. It does work, Stephen. All right, so we have to wrap there. Stephen, the book is called Universe of Two. Stephen, it's a smashing success. I was deeply moved by it. And I also want to say thank you for being the first ever guest on The Thoughtful Bro.
Such a great conversation. Thank you. I hope you get a great run with this and a ton of good bros on.
Thank you, man. Hey, it's not just for bros. It's a bro kind of perspective, but The Thoughtful Bro is for everybody. So anyway, I'm just going to wrap right now and say, folks, every 2 o'clock on Tuesday, we will be here. In the coming weeks, we have Jen De Leon, an exciting debut YA novelist. We have the legendary speculative fiction author Jeff Vandermeer coming up as well. So we'll see you all back here soon. Stephen, thank you once again, and best of luck on Universe of Two.
Thanks so much.
All right.